Hello everyone. My name is Anouk Tuijman. I work at the Trimbos Institute in the Netherlands, which is a research institute for mental health and addiction. And I and my colleagues specifically focus on gaming, gambling, and digital balance, with the last being the relationship between digital media use and health. And so today I'm going to talk about a project that we did on the risks, benefits, and regulation of video games, specifically in the Netherlands. Now, this project was a really large project, so I won't have enough time with these 20 minutes to explain everything we did. So I'm going to give you some highlights and some of the conclusions that I hope will be interesting to you all. Now, if you are interested in knowing more about it, there are two links here on the slide, but you can also Google the title of the presentation. You can find an English management summary. The whole report is in Dutch. And there is quantitative research output on open science framework. Now, if you have any questions after reading those, feel free to contact me or my colleague, Tony van Roy. My email will be at the end. So that's a little disclaimer. Let's get into these highlights and conclusions. So what we did in this project is we looked at four components. First, we did a data-driven approach to categorize risks and benefits of video games. And then we analyzed some of the most popular games played in the Netherlands on these risks and benefits. We interviewed experts on both the regulations that are already present in the Netherlands, but also what they deemed important and should be prioritized. And then we did interviews with international experts to have a comparison with the international situation and to get some lessons learned on, what the Netherlands could improve. So starting with these categories of risks and benefits, we extracted all the literature that there is on video gaming from Web of Science, which was roughly between 45 and 50,000 articles. And we extracted all the keywords from there, and any keyword that was mentioned 5 times or more, we categorized in either a risk or a benefit or non-relevant. For example, a method wouldn't be relevant as a risk or benefit. And we clustered those keywords into categories of risks and benefits. And then we did specific searches on Web of Science, PsycInfo, and PubMed to look at the literature that was on that category. Now, we came up with 9 categories based on the data, and we added a 10th one, which by the time when we did the literature search, this topic was not that prevalent in the literature yet, but considering we have a 2-day workshop on ethical gaming, I think nowadays it gains more attention. But on the top you see the category that is most that has the most articles, which is health and the impact it has on mental and social health and applied games for mental health specifically. So most articles are written on that topic, and then underneath the last one is marketing and gaming. We see the least articles there, and so they change in size. So for us, these, from this data-driven approach, we would say that the risks and benefits of gaming fall into these 9 categories, and adding the 10th, which I will explain a little further later. Now we then looked at, okay, if we have these risks and benefits, what is the quality of evidence, the level of evidence, and how much attention is there to these risks and benefits before we look at what kind of regulation should we have for each risk. And I'm going to give you a few examples of that. So one of the benefits was learning and educational games. Now, as you can see, the quality of evidence was determined by the number of trials, randomized controlled trials, the number of meta-analysis, and the number of reviews. And for learning and educational games, there are quite a lot. So there is some, quality, some level of evidence. But these meta-analysis and the reviews also conclude that the quality of the individual studies are not that high. So there should be more rigorous studies on learning. But in general, the conclusion is that applied gaming, serious gaming, could be used to teach certain skills, certain knowledge, as effective as control conditions, but sometimes even more effective than other more traditional methods. And we see a high attention for this topic. This is something that is pushed by both education, but also by the industry. They find this an important topic. Now, if we look at a less prevalent or less studied risk, then there's gambling and gaming. So here you can see there are no trials or meta-analysis, at least at the time when we did the study. Of course, the literature has updated, but the trend of the ratio between the number of trials for this one compared to the learning category, of course, is somewhat the same. But there are some reviews, but there are not a lot, and the attention to it was still limited but increasing. And the attention mainly was on either simulated gambling games, which usually are published by gambling companies as like a way to teach gambling without using money, in the hopes that once children, for example, become of legal age of gambling, the transfer would be a little easier. But also, this also covers loot boxes, for example, where gambling mechanics are used in games, not necessarily to win money like in gambling products, but the mechanism of it is very similar to it. And researchers are wondering, is this a risk for problematic gambling in a later age when they're older? So another risk is the design choices, the manipulative design, and complex innovation. And so this is not something that really came up from the keywords, but it's something that the researchers present here are more concerned about. And by then the level of evidence was still limited, but the attention was increasing. And we used, these design choices to analyze the popular games, because we, saw a need for regulation on these topics as well. And I'm not going into a lot of detail because my colleague Tony van Rooij gave a talk I think 2 hours ago on their framework, on our framework on how to look at ethical design. But I want to highlight here that we look at the design choices that influence time of players, that influence the money that players spend, and that influence the social environment. And we use those three categories as well to analyze our games and to look at, what kind of regulations, or should there be regulations on this as well. Okay, so the second part of this project was analyzing popular games. The examples here are just a few, although we used the data from 2020 to see what are the most popular ones. I think some of these are still really popular now, but for example, Gardenscapes has decreased in popularity, and Among Us, of course, was in the lockdown period, in the pandemic period, really popular, but is less so now. Now, what we see if we analyze these games, that there's these risks and benefits. Some of them are present in all of them, like the risk for physical health, especially in terms of sedentary behavior, of course, is relevant for all of these. And both the risks and benefits for social and mental health, can be found in these games. And other risks and benefits, they differ between games, and I'll give 2 examples afterwards. And when it comes to these design choices, where either time, money, or the social environment is influenced, we see that mainly in these games, you see some kind of manipulation of time and finances, and less so in social manipulation. But I'll give an example of how some of these games do that. So the first is Roblox that we looked at, and Roblox has a PEGI label of 7 years and older, and there's because of violence, fear, and in-game purchases. Now, Roblox, of course, is played by a lot of children, which is why there's special attention for this game. And risks in Roblox, besides the general risk that we identify in most of these popular games, include, for example, the chat function. And both in the game, there's a chat function, but there you also see that children use a chat function outside of the game, which therefore is not moderated by Roblox. But it's also more difficult for parents to disable that chat, while that is possible in Roblox. And these are challenges, I think, that the gaming industry is struggling with, but we should also take these into account when it comes to regulation. Like, how do you deal with that kind of workarounds. Like we can target a game, but if there's a system outside the game, how do you deal with that? Now, we also see in a game that's so popular with children that there are a lot of in-game transactions and revenue has increased. So, for example, from 2017 to 2020, revenue from in-game transactions in Roblox increased from 45 million to 920 million. So, and that is a common trend we see in a lot of popular games. Of course, that money has to come from somewhere. And so the design, of course, is pushed towards spending as much money in these games as possible. And one of them is, for example, that if you pay money for certain in-game features, you get a gameplay advantage. And that's a strong motivation for some of these players to get better. Now, another example are mobile games, and we analyzed Gardenscapes, which has a PEGI label of 3. So there are not a lot of there's not a lot of information on whether there's a risk here. And it has decreased in popularity in recent years, but this type of game is still popular. And it does not have a very strong in-game culture and a chat like Roblox, but it does include designs that can be considered social manipulation. But for example, coins and additional lives are granted if players invite friends to play through Facebook, or players can also request additional lives from friends. And that's a kind of social manipulation that should be good. It's good to look at regulation at these kind of systems as well. Now, example of financial manipulation is that some levels are exceptionally hard, but these levels can be made easier if a player buys certain features. And Gardenscapes also includes loot boxes. Now, this PEGI rating, of course, of 3 years and older does not describe these design elements that might manipulate the time and the money that the players spend. So it's not transparent that these elements are in there. So that's one of the conclusions we pulled from this part of the research. Now, in terms of regulations, we interviewed experts from government, from research, from healthcare, but also from the gaming industry. And most experts think that regulation or self-regulation is needed for the mental and social health risks, the games as marketing instruments, problematic gaming, gambling and games, and design choices. And in some cases, actual regulation is needed according to the expert, but in others, they just mentioned that there's so little known yet that there needs to be more research, and the Dutch government should stimulate more research by making grants available. Most of the regulations in the Netherlands that are present at the moment are usually limited to educational measures or grant financing. By now, of course, there are also some promising European regulations that the Dutch government has to use, which are, of course, the Digital Service Act or the Digital Marketing Act. Now, a lot of the risks are also addressed through self-regulation by the industry. And in the Netherlands, especially, there seems to be a heavy reliance on self-regulation. But the Dutch government does not know what the effectiveness is of that self-regulation, nor does it have a system in place to check whether the taken measures are sufficient. And so it is difficult to rely on a system when we don't know whether it's effective, and it might not be effective, but we don't know, and there are no checks in place. So one of our recommendations was to look at that as well. And finally, another conclusion that we took is that the regulation in the Netherlands, especially, was very fragmented within the government. And so not all involved government parties knew of the activities that each ministry did, and nor were they all aware of recent scientific knowledge. And that is something we presented as an outcome as well. And what we see now in the Netherlands is that our Ministry of Internal Affairs has taken that leading role on the subject of video games, especially in the context of youth. And we hope that that will, improve the effectiveness of the regulation a lot more. There were also some requirements for regulations that I think are really interesting to look at. One of them is that regulation should be timeless to be able to address fast changes in technological possibilities. I think loot boxes are one example. That's a very specific form of a design choice. But if you prohibit one of them, there might be a dozen new ones that are developed. So regulation should look at, how can you take those technological changes into account, instead of focusing on very specific measures. It should also be nuanced. As our report showed, games do not only have risks, they have a lot of benefits as well. And it's important with regulations to, limit the risks, but also improve or use the benefits. And I think that's a challenge for governments as well. And then finally, an advice of the experts was to be consistent, in a sense that the policy in one ministry, for example, finance, should be consistent with the policies of a justice department, so that risks are addressed in the same way at all places, and they cannot be mitigated by, going through one or another. That was this one. Okay. So then finally, we did an international comparison where we interviewed experts from different countries on how their regulation, what their regulation looked like. And again, I don't have the time to go into detail yet, but I have 3 lessons from that comparison. So one is the collaboration between gaming industry and government. And, these experts mentioned that it's difficult due to the tension between both economic interest on one side and consumer protection on the other side. And that's something that we also work on gambling, is something we recognize there as well. And it's good to take these apart, to take the tension into account when you look at regulations, and especially the reliance on self regulation that is quite prevalent now. And one of the advices of the experts was to that larger international research projects can help in assessing the possible risk and effects of games to move away from that tension. Now, second one was, while code of conducts can be very helpful, they might be less effective if they are not binding. So a code of conduct can be present, but if they're not binding, the more difficult elements might not be used. Now, an alternative could be to target the reputation of companies by rewarding positive behavior and making harmful choices transparent. And a third advice was that there are no or limited international best practices in terms of policy and regulation due to limited information on their effectiveness. And I think the field could really move forward there's a lot to gain by doing high quality scientific research on these different policy initiatives and regulations. And I think that's also a really important conclusion to take into account. Now, I'm out of time, so I'm gonna wrap this up, I think. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them now. I think there is an opportunity to ask them in person. If something comes up later, feel free to send me an email through the email that is displayed here on the slide. Thank you very much for your attention.